Well, hello, Faith Bible Church. We're broadcasting, or I'm recording this in front of City Hall. And what I want to talk about is Faith Bible Church's response to opening, reopening, and what our role is. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about how a church should reopen, what government's rights are. And I want to give a pro-life perspective on this today. And I hope it's helpful for you to think through what the elders are thinking through in all of this. We all miss the meetings together. We half cry and half have joy at every Sunday morning streaming as we watch the congregation sing together. I mean, we really miss the congregation. And God has given us commands to meet, in a sense, to worship together. And yet at the same time, we're staying home under governor's orders, but also for the health and safety. One of the things that you might ask is, when will we be able to meet again? And another thing to ask is, what about the economics? What about the suffering of people who aren't working? And what about our economy? Should we disobey the government if we feel like our rights are violated? And to cloudy the waters even more, we have all these expert opinions about what we have going on, about whether the government is overreaching or whether the COVID-19 is as serious a threat as we think. What do we do with all of this? Well, what I want to do is give us a pro-life perspective to reopening our economy, reopening our churches, so that it would help us think through this. Christians are called to value all of life, not just the unborn, but also to the vulnerable, to the high risk. And I want to lay out a series of factors for us to think about and what the elders have been thinking about with this. How hard should we push the government? How hard should we push to reopen economy in the church? And we need to be humble and patient with each other because there are different perspectives and different opinions. And as people who are united around the gospel of Jesus Christ, we may have different opinions about other things, and we can be humble and patient and learn from each other with that. So the most important question, obviously, for us to ask is, how do we honor God in this? What has God's word said? Our first question is not, what are my American rights? Our first question is, how do we honor God and honor his word? And so I want to lay out a series of factors, and there's 5 key verses. We'll be putting out a paper with this so that you can take a look at our thinking more specifically. But I want to give out 5 factors that are based on 5 cornerstone verses that help us think about this. Factor number 1 is we need to think about preserving life. How we handle COVID-19 is not first a religious liberty question, but a preservation of life question. Many people are talking about religious liberties being violated, and maybe they're right to do so. But I do want to remind you, Thomas Jefferson, when he penned the Declaration of Independence, talked about unalienable rights, and they are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He knew, and so did our framers and founders, that life must exist before we have liberty. So life is always going to be a key issue. Without life, there is no liberty. So liberty, listen to this, liberty that negligently threatens another's life is unacceptable. It's important to note this. I'm not referring to situations where we are being banned from meeting because we believe the gospel or proclaim the gospel. That's another issue. I'm talking about the threat of an infectious disease and how a church responds and how a culture and government responds. So love does no wrong to a neighbor. Romans 13:10 is a cornerstone principle for us. And it's based in this section of Romans 13 that talks about all of the commands being summed up in one, love your neighbor as yourself, including the command of do not murder. And that's because God so values life. So to summarize it all, our first thing is to do no harm to other people. So we love God first, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. Matthew 22 talks about this with the greatest commandment question. Luke talks about it in Luke 10:25 through 37. And remember, in the Luke section, he follows up these love God, love neighbor with the story of the Good Samaritan helping somebody who was injured and vulnerable. Look at how God values life. I'm going to read a couple verses for you. From Psalm 139, 13 through 14 says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." This is a classic pro-life verse. God formed every person. He's appointed the days, and man is not to usurp them or to take them either by negligence or by murder. Murder was the first sin to require capital punishment, and so the fountainhead of morality when it comes to life is Exodus 20:13, "You shall not murder," the sixth commandment. And then all the other lesser ones work out of it. So things like homicide or negligent homicide or manslaughter, while they're not murder, so to speak, the Bible speaks of these kinds of things, meaning that we're responsible for life because God counts life so precious. Here's an example relating to building codes. This is from Deuteronomy 22:8. "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, a railing, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it." That guilt of blood was being liable in a court for negligence, for failing to take care of family and friends who visited your house. Well, this principle goes throughout the Old Testament in the specific codes and follows through into the New Testament. And the Bible has a very specific set of commands in Leviticus 13 about infectious disease. And that's what we're dealing with right now, is a very infectious disease. This is about the leper. And it's not only about ceremonial uncleanness, it's about spreading of a contagion. It says this, "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone, his dwelling shall be outside the camp." So God provided for the very, very difficult situation of infectious disease. He provided quarantine procedures. So that person couldn't go to public worship, and they had to be isolated away from the community until they were healed. So the Bible really calls us to be careful and considerate about the spread of infectious disease. So when it comes to the reopening of our churches, we have to weigh well the risk to COVID-19. And so information is still coming in. We're still developing our understanding of it. But what we do know is that it's very infectious, and we do know that it has very serious side effects for certain populations that are now called high-risk populations. And we have to be careful about that. People over 65 or people with underlying conditions are high risk. And so when we meet, we have to be ready to handle this. And so we have to think carefully for this. We want to be careful, and we want to remember, as I shoot this, we're crossing the 90,000 person death toll in the US. That is a very significant number, and we should be quite concerned about that. And that's only in 10 weeks of this. It's not the typical flu season where 55,000 people die in a whole flu season. This is in 10 weeks. So we know something is serious, and so we have to carefully consider what we're going to be doing. And so here's the pro-life question for us as a church and for each of us as a citizen, as an individual. Are we ready for the responsibility? Are we ready for the responsibility of catching the virus and then spreading it to somebody else? What if you catch it at church and you bring it to work outside of church and infect somebody in a high-risk population and they're not a Christian? I mean, these are responsibilities. I'm not saying that if you don't know you have it and you don't know you're sick and you accidentally pass it on to somebody, you're committing murder. I'm just asking the responsibility question that since we don't know a lot about the disease yet, we just know it's contagious, and we just know that you can be sick with it without showing symptoms. We have to ask how we're going to be responsible. And I urge you, the stakes are too high for bias against atheists, bias against opposing political parties, or the government when it comes to statistics and scientific investigation. A Bible expert is not an infectious disease expert just because he found an article on the internet, or he listens to a pastor with good rhetoric or confidence. I would strongly urge, and the elders strongly urge, objectivity and caution. Remember, the governor of every state has a God-given responsibility to preserve life in the state. Ours in Washington is wildly inconsistent. By allowing marijuana stores and liquor stores to remain open as essential and leaving churches closed as non-essential, I mean, it's a serious question, a serious problem. We know that those kinds of things, marijuana and liquor stores, they have known health risks, but that does not seem to be curtailed. Our governor allows abortion and supports abortion, which we all agree is murder. But in this case, he seems aimed at keeping the spread of COVID-19 to a minimum. And so we may disagree how far he goes, but we have to think of it this way. If that's his God-given mandate to protect and preserve life, we shouldn't do anything that makes his job harder. We should do what we can to make his job easier. If we as elders decide to open the church, we're responsible at some level if we have been negligent in carefully considering the safety and health of our people. So when can we open? Well, we can open when we have clear enough markers, clear enough safety precautions to minimize the risks. We're not going to eliminate COVID-19, but we can help mitigate risks. I think of it like traffic. This has been a common illustration. There's a risk every time we drive, but because there's risks when we drive, we don't close our churches for that. Well, true enough, because we have decent roads in Spokane, we have speed limits, we have license requirements, reasonable license requirements, but we have a whole series of things like law enforcement and so on that help mitigate the risks of driving. We need to have the same thing at the church. We're not going to eliminate all risk, but we can mitigate it so that we are responsible to not infect somebody else or not take an infection out into the world where we could hurt somebody else. Remember, love does no harm. When we gather as a church, we're going to take all the responsibility and wise action. We're going to listen to recommendations, all of these that we can, so that we can open as safely as we can. Here's the second factor: provide for your families. God has ordained work as a means to provide what is needed for physical life. This comes out of 1 Timothy 5:8. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. People want to work. Most unbelievers want to work. Most people want to earn their income. And the Proverbs are filled with injunctions or charges for us to work and work hard. And so what Paul tells Timothy in light of taking care of a family's widow applies to the whole family. We should try to work hard to work. Well, what if our work gives us coronavirus, or what if we take COVID-19 coronavirus to our work? We have some thinking to do about that, and we want to be careful. Can you go to work, infect someone else at the risk of their death? Well, no. The priority of preserving life comes into play. God has graciously given us the church. The church is eager to assist financially. The generosity of you saints has been just astounding, and there would be financial resources for people who can't go to work. Well, what if I'm healthy? What do I do? Well, you'd seek to work as best you can. What we're talking about, or what we all think as elders, is that we can open more jobs, more of the economy, and patiently watch the numbers to look at the rise of the virus. We know we don't have endless resources, even the government doesn't, and so we will have to go back to work at some point. And so we're urging personal care and personal responsibility about work and about family and about then regathering as a church. Factor 3, value the vulnerable. So first, we need to preserve life. Second, we need to provide for our families. And third, we need to value the vulnerable. We must not be pro-life for the unborn, yet flippant about the deaths of the aged. There's too often a gross insensitivity in the evangelical community toward families who have lost loved ones. When the governor, who is a pro-abortionist, is more compassionate toward the losses of families in Washington than church leaders who spout off on Facebook or on social media, I think we're in serious need of repentance. 90,000 people have died in 10 weeks across the US. And doesn't that crush the heart of us as Christians? So most are older with pre-existing conditions, but they are still image bearers, and we still have a responsibility. I think of James 1:27, which talks about the widow and the orphan. That is the vulnerable in society, to help us be guiding here. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So across the Old and New Testament, the poor, the vulnerable, the sick, the suffering deserve special attention and help. This word visiting the orphan is to visit, to rescue, to help, protect. And so it's to show up and bring relief. So we need to have an attitude toward all segments of our society that values the vulnerable. It's going to be hard for me to bring my own mom, who's 78, lives in an assisted living facility, to church. What if she gets it at church and she brings it back to other people? It's a serious situation that we have to think about. We will reopen, but we can only reopen when we have good measures in place to protect the vulnerable. We are eager to reopen, but we must demonstrate love and care for those who should not come. The first way to value them is to do our best to keep them from getting COVID-19. So 3 factors so far. Now the fourth, submitting to government authorities. The stay-at-home orders are being played as government overreach or the threat to religious liberty. And there is legitimate debate about this. Some make good arguments saying, yes, the governor is going beyond his constitutional powers in Spokane County, and others disagree. There are also clear signals to when we're going to be able to tell if the governor's orders are a violation of religious liberties. When a large restaurant at phase 2 opens at 50% capacity, but a church cannot reopen at 50% capacity, then we might have a reason to say, hey, that's not fair. It's good to have civil dialogue about this and not to demonize each other or demonize the government. But let me say it again, without life, there is no liberty. Preserving life is necessary for liberty, including religious liberty. So government's God-given role to protect and preserve human life, that is government's role. God's God-given role is to protect and preserve life. We must be careful not to hinder Governor Inslee's obligation before God. Romans 13:1-4 says this: let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. For he is God's servant for good. We don't submit to the government when it asks us to sin. We should prepare to suffer if we choose not to submit. We may have freedom of conscience to disobey what we believe is illegal, but our first consideration is always preaching the gospel and preservation of life. Are we being ordered to stop preaching the gospel? No. Are we being ordered to disregard human life and the vulnerable? No. We can use dozens of mediums for preaching the gospel, and we can connect with large groups through our technology, and we can drop off gifts. We can make doorstop visits. We can even go on walks with other Christians. Our counselors are even able to meet and give counseling for crisis situations, and they can do this face-to-face with safety protocols. This is nowhere near the situation that Peter and John faced, which is so often cited. In Acts 3:18-20, this is what was done when Peter and John were preaching the gospel. So they called them, this was the Sanhedrin, so they called them and charged them not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. Later on, when the same thing was leveled against them, Peter again said this, Peter the apostle and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. That was in the context of being forbidden to preach the gospel. It was not in the context of protecting people from an infectious disease. So in trying to maintain our religious freedoms, we must not negligently cause the death of one of Christ's sheep. We must make it as easy as possible for the government to uphold its obligation to preserve life. If a church does meet in defiance of governor's orders, it must be ready to be accountable for the lives of the people who come. It must do all diligence to protect the lives of people who gather. So long as the government is not stopping us from preaching Christ, is not causing us to sin, is not doing something illegal, we must submit whether we agree with the government or not. Now, in a democracy, we can petition, we can protest, we can write letters, we can call, and feel free as a Christian to do any of those things so long as your attitude and your words are not sin. If the restrictions placed on us are no longer needed, if they're costing more lives in other ways than they're saving, we of course can speak up and protest. But we must do it with respect toward government's role and the role to preserve human life. This will be very difficult to decide, and much prayer and wisdom is going to be needed. Finally, I want to say this about the gathering of the saints. Factor 5, the gathering of saints. Christians are indeed commanded to gather and worship. Psalm 95:6, Psalm 111:1, all call us together to worship. There is nothing in the Christian life that fills the role of face-to-face gatherings. We are not really doing church when we are all seeing each other live stream, or we are all watching the live stream. But we are doing the best we can to gather around God's word and worship with God's people. There is still a real sense of community. We want to worship God face to face. We are eager for that. But we are also commanded to keep infectious disease from spreading in and outside the community of believers. Back to Leviticus 13. Mitigating the spread of infectious disease for a time appears to be a priority over gathering. The command to gather in Hebrews, it's important to think about, is to those who were themselves forsaking the gathering. This is often quoted as a command to gather, but remember the whole context. People were afraid to gather because they could be persecuted by the government for being followers of Jesus. That's a whole other matter. It wasn't a sickness issue. And if that's the case, we of course would be ready to lose our lives and risk our lives to meet. But listen to what he says. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as it is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. To neglect the gathering of the saints in Hebrews 10:25 is to decisively turn one's back on the gathering and therefore turn one's back on the faith. That's not what we're being asked to do right now. We're not being asked to turn our back on the faith. We're tasked with slowing or stopping the spread of a very virulent and deadly virus. The governor is asking us something more akin to Leviticus 13:45 and 46, which is to quarantine those who can infect others. Perhaps the governor is an overreaction, and perhaps the governor can let Spokane move along in its phases at a faster rate. I'm personally for it. All the elders I've talked to so far are personally for that. We think we could be on a faster track to be meeting. Time will tell. We should be careful not to play the religious liberty card with a cavalier approach to life. So as we tie all of this together, the elders do not feel like at this time we want to petition the governor or protest the governor for overreaching his authority. We believe it is his job to preserve life, and we wish he would broaden out that freedom to the unborn. We want him to protect the unborn too. If he were to let us make our own decision today, whether we could meet or not, we would not feel ready to meet just yet. Most of us would be in favor of a faster phased approach, but we would be wanting to start with businesses so people can provide for their families, monitor the spread of COVID-19, and we would want to see smaller groups be able to meet and then carefully see how the spread of the disease goes. We're discussing now what it's going to look like as each phase comes. If a suit is filed and the governor is given a restraining order, we are weighing out what we will do. We will likely start with smaller groups, making considerations for those in the high-risk category, and we will seek best safety practices for gatherings. There will be a path that preserves life and allows us to reopen our churches. You have to know that this is not the first pandemic or infectious disease. The church has gone through plagues and pestilence, for 2,000 years, there's many examples of church leaders and church history and churches who have figured out ways to keep sick people with the proper care and also keep them from infecting others. So we're going to come through this. God is going to work out his way. God promises that the church will continue to be built and flourish. Our aim is to gather, and in so we are going to seek to preserve life, value the vulnerable, and honor the government. We're going to advocate for businesses to reopen sooner, as long as they can provide safe workplaces. We must be careful not to throw stones at those who will reopen with what they feel like are their legal rights to defy the governor. We won't throw stones. Most of all the people I know who are thinking about that are acutely aware of their accountability toward God, the judge, for human life. We need wisdom, we need prayer, and we need patience. We love you, and we can't wait for the day where we can have group gathering and our corporate gathering.